The parking lot behind Murphy's Tavern reeked of motor oil and stale beer as Thunder Joe revved his Harley, ready to head back to the clubhouse. That's when he spotted the scrawny kid holding a burlap sack, tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. "Mister, please," the boy begged. "My dad says if I don't sell this puppy for $1, he'll—" The kid couldn't finish the sentence. Thunder Joe had spent 15 years as a Hells Angels enforcer, collecting debts with his fists and never showing mercy. But something about this kid's desperation hit different. He pulled out a crumpled dollar bill and took the sack without looking inside. The boy's relief was immediate, overwhelming. He clutched the dollar like it was made of gold, mumbling thank you over and over before disappearing into the maze of rusted cars and broken streetlights that surrounded Murphy's. Joe secured the sack to his bike with a bungee cord, feeling something small and warm shift inside the rough fabric. Whatever was in there wasn't making any noise, which concerned him more than he cared to admit. Inside, the air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the perpetual smell of leather and motor oil. His brothers were scattered around the main room, some playing pool, others nursing beers and planning their next run. Razor Rick looked up from the card table where he was winning someone's weekly pay. "What's in the bag, Thunder?" "Kid was selling a puppy," Joe replied, setting the sack gently on the bar. The statement drew attention from across the room. Snake Williams laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Since when do you care about strays?" Snake asked, his scarred face twisting into a grin. "Unless you're planning to use it for target practice." Joe ignored the comment and carefully untied the rope that held the sack closed. His fingers worked slowly, methodically, as if he were defusing a bomb rather than opening a simple burlap bag. The room fell quiet, except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and someone's motorcycle cooling down outside. What he found inside made him freeze completely. It wasn't a puppy. It wasn't even a dog. Curled up in the bottom of the sack, barely the size of Joe's fist, was a tiny monkey. Its fur was matted and dirty, and one of its small arms hung at an odd angle, clearly broken. The creature's eyes were open but unfocused, and its breathing came in short-labored gasps. Someone had wrapped a dirty bandana around its midsection, probably trying to stop bleeding from wounds Joe could only guess at. "What the hell is that?" Razor Rick stood up so fast his chair fell backward. Joe reached into the sack with surprising gentleness, his massive hands seeming impossibly large as he lifted the injured animal. The monkey didn't resist or try to bite. It simply looked at him with dark, intelligent eyes that held more pain than any living thing should endure. "It's hurt bad," Joe said quietly, his voice lacking its usual edge. "Real bad." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. Joe felt the weight of 15 years pressing down on him, 15 years of choosing the wrong path, of taking instead of giving, of causing pain instead of healing it. He looked at the small creature in his hands, noting how it seemed to trust him despite everything it had obviously endured. "No," Joe said firmly, "we're not selling it." The room erupted in confused voices. Questions flew from every direction, but Joe wasn't listening anymore. He was focused entirely on the fragile life in his hands and the strange feeling growing in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in so long he'd forgotten what to call it. It might have been hope, or maybe it was the first stirring of a conscience he'd thought was dead and buried years ago. Either way, everything was about to change. The rain hammered against the windows of Tank's garage as he carried the burlap sack inside, his heavy boots echoing off the concrete floor. The space smelled of motor oil and cigarettes, tools scattered across workbenches between half-assembled Harley engines. He set the sack down gently on his kitchen table, surprised by his own careful handling of whatever cowered inside. "All right, little guy," he muttered, his gravelly voice softer than usual. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Tank untied the rope with thick fingers that had broken more noses than he cared to count. The burlap fell away, and he froze. Inside wasn't a puppy at all, but something that made his breath catch in his throat. A tiny humanoid creature, no bigger than his hand, with delicate pointed ears and skin that seemed to shimmer faintly in the fluorescent light. Its eyes, large and golden, blinked up at him with a mixture of terror and curiosity. "What the hell?" Tank stumbled backward, knocking over a beer bottle that shattered on the concrete. The creature flinched at the sound, curling into itself like a frightened child. Tank rubbed his eyes hard, certain the Jack Daniels from earlier was playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, the impossible thing was still there, breathing rapidly, its tiny chest rising and falling beneath what looked like tattered leaves fashioned into primitive clothing. His first instinct was to call Snake or Razor, get the boys over here to figure out what kind of freak show nonsense this was. But something in those golden eyes stopped him. The creature was injured. He could see cuts along its arms and a nasty bruise spreading across its left shoulder. It looked up at him with the same desperate hope he'd seen in too many broken things. "Jesus," Tank whispered, slowly approaching the table again. "You're real, aren't you?" The creature made a sound barely audible, something between a whimper and words in a language he couldn't understand. It tried to stand but immediately collapsed, clutching its side. Tank's hands hovered uselessly in the air. He'd never felt so out of his depth, not even during his first prison stint when he was just 19 and thought his leather jacket made him invincible. This was different. This was something that shouldn't exist, something that made his world of drugs and violence and brotherhood seem suddenly small and brutal. "Okay," he said, more to himself than to the creature. "Okay. You're hurt. I can deal with hurt." He grabbed a clean shop rag and dampened it at the sink, moving slowly so he wouldn't startle the thing. When he returned, the creature watched him with those impossibly large eyes, still trembling but no longer trying to flee. Tank knelt beside the table, bringing himself down to the creature's level. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said quietly. "Promise." The word felt strange in his mouth. When was the last time he'd made a promise that didn't involve breaking someone's legs or moving product across state lines? He dabbed gently at the cuts on the creature's arms, amazed at how delicate it felt, like handling spun glass. The creature winced but didn't pull away, and Tank found himself holding his breath, terrified of applying too much pressure with hands that had done so much damage over the years. "There," he said when he'd cleaned the worst of the wounds. "That's better, right?" The creature looked up at him and spoke again, still in that musical language he couldn't comprehend, but this time its voice carried less fear and something that might have been gratitude. Tank sat back on his heels, staring at this impossible thing that had wandered into his life for the price of $1. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, and he thought about Bulldog beating that sack, about the casual cruelty that had been as natural as breathing to both of them. How many times had he been the one swinging, the one taking pleasure in another's pain? The creature struggled to its feet again, wobbling but determined. It pointed to itself and said something that sounded like Pip. Then it pointed to Tank, its head tilted in question. "Tank," he said, tapping his chest. "My name's Tank." "Tank," the creature repeated, its pronunciation careful and clear, and something in Tank's chest tightened unexpectedly. His phone buzzed with a text from Snake about church tomorrow, the weekly meeting where they'd plan their next score, their next territory grab, their next act of violence in service of the club. Tank looked at the message, then at the tiny being trying to communicate with him despite everything it had been through. For the first time in 20 years, Tank wondered if there might be something in the world worth protecting instead of destroying. The thought scared him more than any rival gang or police raid ever had, because it suggested his life could be something other than what it had always been. The creature, Pip, settled back down on the table, those golden eyes still fixed on his face with impossible trust. The thing wouldn't stop shivering. Tank had wrapped it in his leather jacket, but even in the warmth of his apartment above the auto shop, the creature trembled like a leaf in a hurricane. He'd gotten a better look at it under the fluorescent lights, and what he saw made his stomach clench in ways that had nothing to do with the whiskey he'd been nursing. It wasn't a puppy. Hell, he wasn't even sure what it was. The size was right for a young dog, maybe 8 weeks old, but everything else was wrong. The ears were too pointed, almost elfin. The eyes were too large for its head, a startling amber color that seemed to hold an intelligence that made Tank's skin crawl. And the fur, if you could call it that, had an odd iridescent quality that shifted from silver to pale gold depending on how the light hit it. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, settling into his beaten recliner. The creature, he'd started thinking of it as it, because he couldn't bring himself to call it a dog, lifted its head and looked directly at him. Those amber eyes seemed to pierce right through him, and for a moment Tank felt exposed in a way that reminded him of being 8 years old and standing before his father after breaking something valuable. He shook off the feeling and reached for the convenience store dog food he'd grabbed on the way home. The creature sniffed at the kibble he poured into a makeshift bowl, then looked back at him with what could only be described as disappointment. "Picky eater, huh?" Tank said. "Well, it's what I got." Instead of eating, the thing curled up tighter in his jacket and closed its eyes. Tank found himself studying its breathing, counting the rise and fall of its tiny chest. When had he ever cared if anything lived or died? The question bothered him more than he wanted to admit. His phone buzzed. A text from Razor. "Church tomorrow night. Don't be late." Church meant club business, and club business meant decisions that usually involved pain for someone. Tank had never questioned it before. You rode with the angels, you followed orders, you kept your mouth shut, simple as breathing. But tonight, with this strange creature sleeping in his jacket, Tank found himself thinking about things he'd buried long ago. Like the kid he'd been before his father's fists taught him that violence was the only language that mattered. Like the dreams he'd had before the club became his family and crime became his livelihood. He must have dozed off because the next thing he knew, something was tugging at his shirt. Tank's eyes snapped open, his hand automatically reaching for the knife he kept in his boot. Then he saw the creature standing on his chest, those amber eyes fixed on his face. "Hungry now?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. But when he moved to get up, the thing pressed its paws against his chest and made a sound unlike anything he'd ever heard. Not quite a bark, not quite a whimper, something almost musical, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Tank froze. In 20 years of violence, he'd learned to read danger in a man's eyes, to sense threat in a room full of bikers. But this was different. This felt like communication. "You trying to tell me something?" The creature tilted its head and made the sound again, softer this time. Then it did something that made Tank's blood run cold. It placed one tiny paw over his heart and closed its eyes, as if it were listening to something only it could hear. Heat spread from where the creature touched him, but not the kind of heat Tank knew from anger or violence. This was gentle, warm in a way that reminded him of summer afternoons before his world went dark. For just a moment he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, peace. Then the creature opened its eyes and looked at him with an expression so human, so knowing, that Tank had to look away. "What are you?" he whispered again. This time, he could have sworn he heard an answer, not in words but in the feeling that suddenly filled his mind. Images flashed behind his eyes, green forests, starlight, and something that might have been magic if Tank believed in such things. He didn't believe in magic. He believed in chrome and steel, in the roar of engines and the crack of bones. He believed in the code of the club and the weight of his fists. But as the creature settled back down on his chest and began to purr, actually purr, like some kind of cat, Tank found his certainties beginning to crack. Outside, his Harley sat silent in the darkness, waiting for another ride into violence. Inside, something was changing in Tank's chest, something that had been frozen for so long he'd forgotten it existed. The creature's purring grew louder, and Tank felt himself drifting toward sleep again, one massive hand unconsciously moving to protect the tiny being on his chest. Tomorrow he'd have to face Razor and the club. Tonight, for the first time in 20 years, Tank felt something other than anger. The thing had been sleeping for 3 hours straight, curled up in Tank's leather jacket like it belonged there. He sat on the edge of his unmade bed, nursing his 4th beer and trying to make sense of what he'd brought home. Every few minutes he'd lean forward to check if it was still breathing, watching the tiny rise and fall of its chest. His phone buzzed. Text from Razor, prospect meeting tonight, 8 p.m. Don't be late. Tank glanced at the clock. 6:30. He'd have to leave soon, but the thought of abandoning the creature made his stomach twist. What if it woke up scared? What if it tried to escape and hurt itself? The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 days ago, he'd put a man in the hospital over a $50 debt. Now he was worried about leaving a mystery animal alone for a few hours. A soft chirping sound made him freeze. The creature was stirring, stretching tiny limbs that definitely weren't paws. Tank set down his beer and moved closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over the makeshift nest. 2 large, dark eyes opened and fixed on his face. Not puppy eyes, something more intelligent, more aware. The creature sat up slowly, and Tank got his first clear look at it in proper light. It was roughly the size of a small cat, but its proportions were all wrong. The head was too large, the limbs too delicate and elongated. Its skin had a translucent quality, pale green with darker veins visible underneath. But the eyes, those eyes held a depth that made Tank's breath catch. "What the hell are you?" he whispered. The creature tilted its head, studying him with the same intensity he was studying it. Then it did something that made Tank's blood run cold. It smiled. Not an animal expression, but a distinctly knowing, almost human smile. Tank's phone rang, making them both jump. Razor's name flashed on the screen. "Where are you?" Razor's voice was sharp with irritation. "Running late." "Give me 20 minutes. 20 minutes? The prospect's already here, and Viper's asking questions about your commitment to the club." Tank's jaw tightened. Viper had been gunning for his position for months, looking for any excuse to challenge his standing. Missing a prospect meeting would give him ammunition. "I'll be there," Tank said, ending the call. He looked back at the creature, which had moved to the edge of the jacket and was examining its surroundings with obvious curiosity. When it spotted the water bowl Tank had set out earlier, it made a soft, trilling sound. Tank helped it down to the floor, surprised by how light it was. The creature moved with an odd grace, not quite walking, not quite crawling, but something in between. At the water bowl, it cupped the liquid in its tiny hands, definitely hands, Tank realized, not paws, and drank delicately. "I have to go," Tank said, feeling ridiculous for talking to it. "But I'll be back, okay?" The creature looked up at him, water droplets clinging to what might have been whiskers or sensory organs around its mouth. It made another soft sound, almost like it understood. Tank grabbed a clean towel and gently lifted the creature back onto the bed, arranging the makeshift nest in a corner where it couldn't fall. He left the water bowl nearby and scattered some crackers on a plate, unsure what it might eat, but hoping for the best. The ride to the clubhouse usually cleared Tank's head, but tonight the wind couldn't blow away his preoccupation. He kept thinking about those intelligent eyes, that unsettling smile. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural, at least not naturally from around here. The Iron Wolves clubhouse sat on the outskirts of town, a squat concrete building surrounded by motorcycles and bad intentions. Tank parked his Harley and tried to shift his mindset back to club business, but his thoughts kept drifting to the creature alone in his apartment. Inside, smoke hung thick in the air, and the familiar sounds of pool games and loud conversation should have felt like home. Instead, Tank felt oddly disconnected, like he was watching everything through glass. "Look who decided to show up," Viper called out from the bar, his scarred face twisted in a smirk. "Thought maybe you'd gone soft, Tank." A few of the younger members chuckled, but the older ones watched Tank's reaction carefully. Disrespect in front of prospects was serious business. Tank moved toward Viper with deliberate slowness, his size advantage obvious. "You got something to say to me?" But even as he fell back into the familiar rhythm of dominance and intimidation, part of his mind remained in that quiet apartment, wondering if the creature was afraid, if it understood he was coming back, if it would still be there when he did. The prospect meeting began, and Tank forced himself to focus, but something fundamental had shifted. The violence and posturing that had defined his life for 15 years suddenly felt hollow, like he was playing a role that no longer fit. The thing wouldn't stop shivering. Jake had carried the sack into his apartment above the garage, past empty beer bottles and motorcycle magazines scattered across surfaces that hadn't seen cleaning in months. The small creature, whatever it was, had gone completely silent during the ride, but now tremors ran through its tiny body like electric current. He'd seen fear before. Hell, he'd caused plenty of it. But this was different. This was something primal, something that reached past the leather and tattoos and years of cultivated menace to grab hold of something he'd thought was long dead. Easy, he heard himself whisper, the word foreign on his lips. When was the last time he'd spoken gently to anything? Under the harsh fluorescent light of his kitchen, Jake got his first clear look at what he'd bought. Definitely not a puppy. The creature was about the size of a small dog, but its limbs were too long, too delicate. Its face was almost human, but not quite, with large dark eyes that held an intelligence that made his skin crawl and his heart race simultaneously. Fine silver-white hair covered most of its body, matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Jake had seen plenty of blood. This wasn't fresh, but it told a story of recent violence that made his jaw clench. The creature's eyes tracked his movements with hyper-aware precision, ready to bolt or defend itself, despite being barely larger than a house cat. Jake recognized that look. He'd worn it himself as a kid, before he'd learned to hit back harder than anyone hit him. "You hungry?" The question surprised him. He'd meant to figure out what the hell this thing was, maybe call animal control or something. Instead, he found himself opening his refrigerator, staring at its pathetic contents. Beer, leftover pizza, something that might have once been milk. Behind him, a small sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a sigh. Jake turned back to find the creature trying to stand on shaking legs. It made it halfway up before collapsing, those two intelligent eyes never leaving his face. Waiting for the next cruelty, expecting it. Something twisted in Jake's chest, sharp and unexpected. This creature knew that language too. Someone had taught it well. "Son of a bitch," Jake muttered, but there was no heat in it. He grabbed a clean dish towel, the cleanest thing in his apartment, and ran warm water over it. The creature tensed as he approached, but didn't try to flee. Couldn't, probably. Jake had never been gentle with anything in his life. His hands, scarred from countless fights and stained with motor oil and worse things, looked huge and clumsy as he carefully cleaned dried blood from the creature's matted fur. Those dark eyes watched every movement, waiting for the gentleness to turn to violence. Because that's what this was, wasn't it? Not a deformed animal or some exotic pet. Something else entirely. The creature's breathing had steadied, and some of the desperate tension had left its small frame. When Jake reached for a bowl and filled it with water, those intelligent eyes tracked the movement with something that might have been hope. It drank greedily, desperately, confirming Jake's suspicion that it had been neglected for days, maybe longer. The asshole with the truck had probably been trying to get rid of evidence, not make a quick buck. "What the hell are you?" Jake asked quietly, settling back on his heels. The creature looked up from the water bowl, tilting its head in a gesture so human it was unsettling. His phone buzzed. Text from Razor, "Slub meeting tonight. Mandatory. Got business to discuss." Jake stared at the message, then at the creature watching him with those fathomless dark eyes. The Crimson Wolves were his brothers, his family, his entire world. They'd pulled him off the streets, given him purpose and protection, and a place to belong. They'd also taught him that weakness was death, that mercy was for fools, and that anything different was to be crushed or exploited. The creature made a soft sound, almost like a question. "Yeah," Jake said, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. "I know." He'd have to leave soon for the meeting. But first, he needed to figure out what to do with his unexpected house guest. Because one thing was becoming crystal clear. He couldn't let anyone else know about this. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The morning sun cut through the grimy windows of Tank's apartment like accusatory fingers, illuminating the chaos of empty beer bottles and overflowing ashtrays that decorated every surface. Tank groaned and rolled over on his couch, his leather jacket still clinging to his massive frame from the night before. The events at Murphy's felt like a fever dream. The desperate junkie, the mysterious sack, and what he'd found inside. A soft, chittering sound made him freeze. It hadn't been a dream. Tank sat up slowly, his eyes scanning the apartment until they landed on the makeshift bed he'd created from an old towel near the radiator. The small creature was awake, those impossibly large eyes reflecting the morning light like black mirrors. It hadn't moved from where he'd placed it, but Tank could see it was alert, watching him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, running a hand through his greasy hair. The creature tilted its head at the sound of his voice, and Tank felt that same electric sensation he'd experienced the night before, as if something was probing the edges of his mind. He shook his head violently, chalking it up to too much whiskey and not enough sleep. His phone buzzed against the coffee table, the screen showing Razor's name. Tank let it ring. The last thing he needed was his club brothers asking questions about his impulsive purchase. How could he explain that he'd bought what he thought was a puppy from a strung-out addict behind a dive bar? How could he explain what he'd actually found? The creature made another sound, softer this time, almost like a whimper. Despite himself, Tank felt something twist in his chest. When was the last time anything had depended on him? When was the last time he'd been responsible for something other than collecting debts and cracking skulls? "You hungry?" he asked, immediately feeling ridiculous for talking to it. Tank shuffled to his kitchen, which consisted of a mini-fridge, a hot plate, and a sink full of dirty dishes. He had beer, leftover pizza that had seen better days, and a half-empty jar of peanut butter, not exactly creature food. He grabbed a small bowl and filled it with water, then tore off a piece of the least moldy pizza and brought both over to his unexpected house guest. The creature sniffed delicately at the pizza, but showed more interest in the water, lapping at it with a tongue that seemed too long for its small mouth. As it drank, Tank found himself studying its features more carefully in the daylight. The skin wasn't quite fur, but it wasn't scales either, something in between that seemed to shift and shimmer when it moved. The limbs were definitely not canine. They were too long, too articulated, ending in what looked almost like tiny hands. "You're not from around here, are you?" Tank said quietly. The creature looked up at him, water dripping from its chin, and Tank could have sworn he saw something like understanding in those dark eyes. More than understanding, recognition, as if it knew exactly what he was thinking. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Snake, probably wondering why he'd missed church last night. The fallen angels took their weekly meetings seriously, and unexplained absences led to uncomfortable questions. Tank knew he couldn't hide forever, but he also couldn't leave the creature alone. Not yet. A heavy knock at his door made both Tank and the creature freeze. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, followed by a familiar voice. "Tank! Open up, brother. We need to talk. Razor." Tank's mind raced. He grabbed the creature gently, surprised by how warm and light it was, and looked around frantically for somewhere to hide it. The bedroom was a disaster zone. The bathroom wasn't much better, but the hall closet might work. He carefully placed the creature behind a pile of old coats and leathers, putting a finger to his lips in what he hoped was a universal gesture for silence. The creature's eyes never left his face, and Tank felt that strange mental pressure again, stronger this time. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt sideways, and he could have sworn he heard something that wasn't quite a voice whisper in his head. Safe. Trust. The knocking turned to pounding. "I know you're in there, Tank. Your bike's outside." "About time," Razor growled, pushing past Tank into the apartment. "We got problems, brother. Big ones. And they might be coming for you next." The morning sun cast long shadows across the clubhouse parking lot as Tank pulled up on his Harley, the dragon perched carefully in the modified saddlebag he'd fashioned from an old leather jacket. 3 weeks had passed since he'd brought the creature home, and word was spreading through the club like wildfire. Whispers followed him wherever he went, and he could feel the weight of curious and suspicious stares. Snake and Diesel were already waiting by the clubhouse steps, their arms crossed and expressions hard. Behind them, Tank could see at least 6 other members lingering near the entrance, pretending to work on their bikes while actually positioning themselves for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Well, well," Snake called out as Tank cut his engine. "Look who finally decided to show up to church." Tank carefully lifted the dragon from its makeshift carrier, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from one of the prospects who'd never seen the creature up close. The little dragon had grown noticeably in the past few weeks, now about the size of a small cat, its scales gleaming like polished emeralds in the morning light. "Been hearing some interesting stories about you, Tank," Diesel said, stepping forward. His hand rested casually on his belt buckle, but Tank noticed how his fingers twitched toward the knife he kept sheathed there. "Stories about you going soft, turning down runs, spending your time playing house with some kind of freak show." The dragon stirred in Tank's arms, its golden eyes fixing on Diesel with an intelligence that made the man take an involuntary step backward. Tank stroked the creature's neck gently, feeling the slight vibration that meant it was about to purr, a sound that had become as comforting to him as the rumble of his bike's engine. "Don't know what stories you've been hearing," Tank said evenly, "but I'm here for church same as always." "Are you?" Snake's voice carried the edge of a challenge. "Because Razor's been looking for you. Says you missed a collection run in Oakland. Says when he called, you told him you were busy." Tank remembered that call. The dragon had been sick, barely eating, its scales dulled with fever. He'd spent 2 days nursing it back to health, researching everything he could find about reptile care, even calling a veterinarian in San Francisco who specialized in exotic animals. The collection run, shaking down a bar owner who was late on protection payments, had seemed insignificant compared to the small life depending on him. "Had priorities," Tank said simply. The word hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. In the Hells Angels hierarchy, nothing took priority over club business. Nothing. Snake's face darkened. "Priorities? Your only priority is supposed to be this club, brother. This family, not some mutant pet you picked up in an alley." The dragon's head lifted at Snake's aggressive tone, and Tank felt its muscles tense. The creature had grown protective of him over the weeks, hissing at anyone who approached with hostile intent. Tank had seen what those small but razor-sharp claws could do to leather. He didn't want to find out what they could do to flesh. "Easy," he murmured to the dragon, then looked up at Snake. "You got something to say to me? Say it direct." Before Snake could respond, the clubhouse door swung open and Razor emerged. The club president moved with the predatory grace of a man who'd survived 3 decades in the outlaw motorcycle world through cunning and calculated violence. His grey beard was meticulously braided, and his cold blue eyes took in the scene with the detached assessment of a general surveying a battlefield. "Gentlemen," Razor said, his voice carrying the authority that made grown men step aside, "I believe we have some business to discuss." The other members formed a loose circle around Tank, their body language making it clear this wasn't a request. Tank had been through club discipline before, knew the ritual, the unspoken rules that governed when a brother stepped out of line. But something felt different this time, more final. The dragon shifted in his arms, looking up at him with those impossibly ancient eyes. In them, Tank saw not just trust but something deeper, a bond that had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. 3 weeks ago, he would have passed the creature off to someone else, rather than face the club's judgment. 3 weeks ago, the approval of these men had been the cornerstone of his identity. Now, as he looked around the circle of faces, some curious, some hostile, all waiting to see if he would bend or break, Tank realized something had fundamentally shifted inside him. The violence that had once defined him felt hollow, distant. The respect he'd fought so hard to earn suddenly seemed like a poor substitute for the simple, pure connection he'd found with this impossible creature. "All right, Razor," Tank said, his voice steady despite the knowledge that the next few minutes would likely change everything. "Let's talk." The dragon's wings had grown stronger over the past week, but Razor hadn't expected to wake up to an empty kennel and the sound of his kitchen being demolished. He stumbled out of bed, pulling on yesterday's jeans, and found Ember perched on top of his refrigerator with what remained of a cereal box clutched in her tiny claws. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, surveying the carnage. Shredded cardboard littered the linoleum floor like confetti, and somehow she'd managed to knock over his coffee maker. The dragon chirped happily at him. Bits of Lucky Charms stuck to her snout. His phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. Tank's name flashed on the screen. "You better get down here, brother." Tank's voice carried an edge Razor hadn't heard in years. "Viper's asking questions about your new pet. Says someone saw you carrying a cage out of Miller's place." Razor's blood went cold. What kind of questions? The kind that end with him wanting to see what you're hiding. "He's got Bobby and Snake with him, heading your way now." The line went dead. Razor looked up at Ember, who had somehow opened the cereal box and was now enthusiastically crunching through marshmallow rainbows. Her scales had grown more pronounced over the week, shifting from the mottled grey-brown of her first days to something that caught the morning light like polished pewter. "Come here, girl," he said softly. "We got company coming." But Ember had discovered the joy of sugar-coated cereal and wasn't interested in climbing down. When Razor reached for her, she spread her wings, now nearly a foot across, and glided to the top of his cabinets, just out of reach. "Sorry, sweetheart, but you need to stay hidden," he whispered, carrying her toward the bedroom. "These aren't the kind of guys who appreciate the unusual." Heavy boots stomped across his front porch. Razor managed to get Ember into a kennel and throw a blanket over it just as his front door exploded inward. Viper didn't believe in knocking. "Morning, sunshine." Viper sauntered in like he owned the place, his leather cut creaking with each step. Bobby and Snake flanked him, their eyes scanning the room like predators. "Heard you've been playing house with some kind of animal." "Don't know what you're talking about." Razor kept his voice level, blocking the hallway that led to his bedroom. "You got a problem with how I live?" Viper's smile never reached his eyes. He was a lean man with prison tattoos crawling up his neck and the kind of reputation that made other clubs cross the street. When he'd taken over as president 6 months ago, things had gotten darker, meaner. Bobby nodded eagerly, his gap-toothed grin making Razor's fists clench. "Told me you paid good money for whatever was in there. Said it was something special." From the bedroom came a soft thump, followed by what sounded like fabric tearing. Razor's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his expression neutral. "You boys got nothing better to do than gossip like old ladies?" Razor stepped closer to Viper, letting his size advantage show. "Maybe you should worry more about club business and less about my personal life. Your personal life becomes club business when you start keeping secrets." Viper's hand drifted toward the knife on his belt. "Now step aside, or we'll move you aside." Another sound from the bedroom, definitely fabric ripping now. Ember had probably worked her way out from under the blanket. If she started flying around the room when these psychopaths broke down his door, God only knew what they'd do to her. "All right," Razor said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You want to see what I bought? Fine. But when you realize you wasted your time over a sick puppy, don't expect me to forget this shit." He led them down the hallway, mind racing. Maybe if he controlled how they saw her, kept them at a distance, he could convince them she was just an unusual dog. Some kind of rare breed with skin problems. The lighting in his bedroom was dim enough that they might not notice her wings if she kept them folded. But when he opened the bedroom door, the kennel was empty except for shredded blanket and bent wire. Ember had squeezed through a gap she'd widened with her claws and vanished. "Well?" Viper pushed past him into the room. "Where's this mysterious pet?" That's when the smoke alarm in the kitchen started screaming. The morning air carried the scent of pine and distant rain as Marcus sat on the cabin's weathered porch, watching Pip chase after a butterfly with determined little hops. 3 weeks had passed since they'd fled the clubhouse, and the creature had grown noticeably larger, now the size of a small cat. Its scales had developed an iridescent sheen that caught the sunlight like polished emeralds. Marcus's phone buzzed against the wooden planks where he'd placed it. Snake's name flashed across the screen for the 4th time that morning. He let it go to voicemail again, knowing he couldn't avoid his brothers forever. The Hells Angels didn't just let members disappear, especially not their sergeant-at-arms. "You're gonna have to face them eventually," he murmured to Pip, who had given up on the butterfly and was now investigating a pile of autumn leaves with intense curiosity. The creature's small chirps had evolved into something resembling musical notes, creating melodies that seemed to respond to Marcus's moods. A distant rumble made Marcus freeze. Motorcycle engines, multiple bikes growing closer. His hand instinctively moved toward the Glock tucked in his waistband as he scooped up Pip and headed for the cabin's back door. But it was too late. 4 Harleys roared into the clearing, kicking up dust and fallen leaves. Snake dismounted first, his face a mask of controlled fury beneath his scraggly beard. Behind him came Razor, Tank, and surprisingly Preacher, the club's oldest member and closest thing they had to a voice of reason. All 4 men wore their colors, the skull and wings patch gleaming on their leather vests. "Well, well," Snake called out, pulling off his helmet. "Found our missing brother playing house in the woods." Marcus stepped onto the porch, keeping Pip hidden inside his jacket. "How'd you find me?" "You ain't the only one with contacts, brother." Razor spat, tobacco juice hitting the dirt near his boots. "Question is, what the hell you doing up here?" Club's been asking questions. Preacher stepped forward, his grey eyes studying Marcus with the intensity that had kept him alive through 40 years of outlaw life. "We told Dallas you were handling some personal business, but that excuse ain't gonna hold much longer." "I needed time to think," Marcus said, feeling Pip shift against his chest. "Think?" Snake's voice rose an octave. "Since when do Hell's Angels need to think? We got a delivery coming through next week. Big one. And our sergeant-at-arms is playing Grizzly Adams in the mountains." Tank cracked his knuckles, the sound like breaking branches. "Maybe he's gone soft. Maybe he ain't one of us anymore." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. Marcus felt his old instincts stirring, the familiar anger that had gotten him through decades of violence and betrayal. But then Pip made a soft sound, barely audible, and something in Marcus shifted. "I ain't gone soft," he said quietly. "But I ain't going back to business as usual either." Snake's hand moved toward his vest, where Marcus knew he kept a switchblade. "The hell does that mean?" "It means I'm done with the runs, done with moving product, done with hurting people who don't deserve it." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Preacher was the first to speak, his voice carrying decades of hard wisdom. "Marcus, you know what you're saying? You know what that means?" Before Marcus could answer, Pip's head poked out from his jacket, drawn perhaps by the tension in the air. The creature's large eyes surveyed the 4 bikers with intelligent curiosity, and it let out a melodic trill that seemed to hang in the air like a question. Tank stumbled backward, his face going pale. "What the holy hell is that thing?" Snake drew his blade, the steel singing as it locked into place. "Some kind of freak. You been keeping pets, Marcus? What's next? Gonna start knitting and baking cookies?" But Preacher stepped closer, his weathered face showing wonder instead of fear. "Jesus, Mary and Joseph," he whispered. "That ain't no ordinary animal." Pip, seemingly unaware of the danger, began to hum, a sound that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone present. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with something that might have been sorrow or hope or both. "It's changing you," Preacher said, his voice barely audible. "Ain't it? That little thing, it's changing you from the inside out." Marcus met the old biker's eyes and saw understanding there, along with something he'd never expected to see from any of his brothers: respect. "Yeah," Marcus said simply. "It is." Snake raised his blade higher, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been fear. "Then maybe it's time we put both of you out of your misery." The confrontation Marcus had been dreading was finally here, And he realized that, for the first time in his life, he wasn't eager for a fight, but he'd protect Pip with everything he had, even if it meant going to war with his own family. The emergency veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Tank's weathered face as he paced the waiting room like a caged animal. His boots echoed against the sterile linoleum, each step marking another minute that Pip remained unconscious behind those steel doors. The antiseptic smell reminded him of hospitals, of too many nights waiting to hear whether brothers would make it through surgery after highway accidents or bar fights gone wrong. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the examination room, her scrubs wrinkled and exhaustion etched around her eyes. Tank stopped mid-stride, reading her expression like he'd learned to read the intentions of rival club members, quickly and completely. "He's stable," she said, pulling off her latex gloves. "But Tank, what you described, the seizure, the way he collapsed, I need to run more tests, whatever it costs." The words came out rougher than he intended. "What kind of tests?" "Blood work, neurological scans. There's something unusual about his brain activity." Dr. Chen hesitated, studying Tank's face. "Has he ever done anything extraordinary? Anything that seemed impossible?" Tank's jaw tightened. Over the past weeks, he'd witnessed things that defied explanation. Pip's uncanny ability to sense danger before it arrived, the way electronics sometimes malfunctioned in his presence, how the little creature seemed to understand complex emotions and respond to unspoken thoughts. But admitting that to anyone, even this veterinarian who'd shown nothing but professionalism, felt like crossing a line he couldn't uncross. "He's smart," Tank said carefully, "real smart." Before Dr. Chen could respond, the clinic's front door chimed. Tank turned to see Razor pushing through the entrance, his prospect patch visible beneath his open jacket. Behind him came two more Devil's Disciples members, their presence immediately transforming the peaceful waiting room into something charged with potential violence. "Tank," Razor's voice carried a mix of relief and urgency. "Been looking all over for you. Club meeting's in an hour. I'm not leaving." Tank positioned himself between Razor and the examination room door. "Pip's sick." Razor's eyes narrowed. "Devil wants everyone there. No exceptions." He glanced at Dr. Chen, who had taken a subtle step backward. "Besides, it's just a—" "Finish that sentence and see what happens." Tank's voice dropped to the register that had preceded countless fights, the tone that made smart men reconsider their words. The two other disciples shifted nervously. They'd heard stories about Tank's legendary temper, had seen the scars that mapped his knuckles like a violent history lesson. But Razor stood his ground, though Tank noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. "Devil's got plans," Razor said. "Big plans. And they involve your little friend." Something cold settled in Tank's stomach. "What kind of plans?" "The kind that make the club rich." Razor's smile held no warmth. "Word's gotten out about what that thing can do. Devil's been taking calls all day, people willing to pay serious money for a private show." Dr. Chen cleared her throat softly. "Gentlemen, this is a medical facility. Perhaps you could—" "Stay out of this, lady." Razor's dismissal was sharp enough to make Tank's hands curl into fists. "She's trying to help him," Tank said. "Show some respect." "Respect?" Razor laughed, but the sound held an edge of disbelief. "Man, listen to yourself. You're choosing some animal over your brothers, over the club that made you what you are." "What I am," Tank said slowly, "is someone who protects what matters. And the club doesn't matter anymore." This came from one of the other disciples, a wiry man named Spike, whose loyalty to Devil bordered on worship. Tank considered the question seriously, surprised by his own hesitation. Weeks ago, the answer would have been automatic. The club was everything, brotherhood above all else, blood in and blood out. But Pip had changed something fundamental in him, had shown him that strength could be gentle, that loyalty could be given freely rather than demanded through fear. "The club matters," he said finally. "But not like this, not using something innocent to make money." Razor shook his head in disgust. "Devil was right. You've gone soft. Lost your edge." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've got 1 hour to show up and explain yourself. After that, well, you know how this works." As the three men left, Tank felt the weight of a decision settling on his shoulders. In 1 hour, he'd have to choose between the life he'd known for over a decade and the small creature lying unconscious behind steel doors. The choice, he realized, had already been made the moment Pip had trustingly fallen asleep in his massive hands. The emergency veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Tank's weathered face as he paced the waiting room for the 3rd hour. His leather jacket creaked with each anxious step, the sound echoing off sterile walls lined with pamphlets about pet care that seemed to mock his current situation. Through the glass doors, he could see other club members maintaining their vigil in the parking lot, their bikes arranged in a protective semicircle around the building. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the treatment room, her scrubs wrinkled and exhaustion evident in her dark eyes. Tank immediately stopped pacing, his massive frame tensing as he searched her expression for any hint of hope or devastation. "She's stable," Dr. Chen said quietly, pulling off her latex gloves. "But Tank, what they did to her?" She shook her head, unable to finish the sentence. "Tell me." His voice came out as a gravelly whisper, hands clenched at his sides. Multiple fractures in her wing bones, some old, some fresh. Severe malnutrition, signs of repeated trauma. The veterinarian's professional composure cracked slightly. "In 30 years of practice, I've never seen systematic abuse like this. Someone was deliberately, methodically hurting her." "Can she recover?" he asked, forcing himself to focus on what mattered most. "Physically, yes. Most of the fractures will heal, though she may never fly the same way again. But psychologically," Dr. Chen glanced toward the treatment room, "she keeps trying to make herself smaller, as if she's expecting another blow. Animals that young shouldn't know that kind of fear." Through the window, Tank watched Iron Mike gesture animatedly to the other bikers, no doubt filling them in on what they'd discovered about Webb's operation. The warehouse raid had uncovered more than anyone expected, not just evidence of dogfighting, but a whole network of illegal animal trafficking that stretched across 3 states. "I want to see her," Tank said. Dr. Chen hesitated. "She's been asking for you. That's actually encouraging. She still trusts despite everything she's endured. But Tank, you need to understand that her recovery depends on stability now. No more adventures, no more violence around her. She needs peace." The irony wasn't lost on him. A creature that had survived unimaginable cruelty was teaching him about the healing power of gentleness, while his world of leather and chrome and brotherhood was built on the very violence she needed to escape. In the treatment room, Pip lay curled in a specially designed incubator, her small body dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding her. Bandages covered her delicate wings, and an 4-line delivered nutrients to her weakened system. But when she saw Tank approach, her eyes brightened with unmistakable recognition and relief. "Hey there, little fighter," he whispered, gently placing one scarred finger against the incubator's glass. Pip struggled to move closer to his touch, her tiny claws scratching against the smooth surface. Dr. Chen watched the interaction with fascination. "I've never seen anything like their bond," she murmured to her assistant. "It's as if they understand each other's pain." Tank remained motionless, except for the steady rhythm of his breathing, letting Pip draw whatever comfort she could from his presence. He thought about the choices ahead of them both. The club was planning retaliation against Webb's organization, and they expected their sergeant-at-arms to lead the charge. It's what he would have done without question just months ago. But now, watching this small creature fight for every breath, Tank realized that revenge wouldn't heal Pip's broken bones or erase her nightmares. Violence had created this situation. More violence wouldn't solve it. "Dr. Chen," he said without turning around, "what would it take to set up a proper recovery space? Everything she'd need to heal completely, whatever it takes." Iron Mike appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Tank, we need to talk. Just got word that Webb's people are already moving their operation. If we don't hit them tonight—" "No," Tank's voice carried an authority that surprised even him. "We're done with that. What are you talking about? They nearly killed her, and you want to just walk away?" Tank finally turned from the incubator, and Mike stepped back involuntarily at the intensity in his eyes. "I'm not walking away from anything, brother. I'm walking towards something better. For both of us." In the incubator, Pip's breathing had become slower and more relaxed, as if Tank's presence alone was medicine enough. The rumble of Harley engines echoed through the warehouse district as Tank pulled into the abandoned lot behind Murphy's bar. Word had spread fast through the club's network. Reaper wanted a full church meeting, and when the president called, you answered. Tank cut his engine and listened to the familiar sounds of his brothers arriving, their bikes creating a symphony of chrome and steel that had once been the soundtrack to his life. Now it felt like a funeral dirge. He dismounted slowly, his leather cut feeling heavier than usual across his shoulders. The small carrier attached to his bike held Luna, who had been unusually quiet during the ride, as if sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. Through the mesh window, he could see her golden eyes watching him with an intelligence that still took his breath away. "This is it, little one," he whispered, his calloused fingers touching the carrier. Time to face the music. The warehouse loomed before him, its broken windows like dead eyes staring down at the gathering storm. One by one, his brothers filed through the rusted metal door, their faces grim beneath their beards and bandanas. Tank recognized the tension in their movements. This wasn't going to be a routine club meeting. Inside, the familiar scent of motor oil, stale beer and cigarettes couldn't mask the underlying current of danger that crackled through the air. The warehouse had served as their church for over a decade, its concrete walls bearing witness to countless decisions that had shaped their brotherhood. Tonight felt different, charged with an electricity that made Tank's skin crawl. Reaper stood at the head of the makeshift table, his massive frame casting shadows in the dim fluorescent light. His eyes, cold as winter steel, swept across the assembled members before settling on Tank with unmistakable menace. The president's hands rested on the table, and Tank noticed the fresh bandages wrapped around his knuckles. Someone had already paid a price tonight. "Brothers," Reaper's voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a blade, "we got ourselves a situation that threatens everything we've built, everything we stand for." Cobra leaned forward from his position at Reaper's right hand, his serpent tattoos seeming to writhe in the shifting light. "We all know why we're here. Tank's been keeping secrets, dangerous secrets." Tank remained standing near the back, the carrier at his feet. He could feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes boring into him, some curious, others openly hostile. These men had been his family for 8 years, had bled with him, fought beside him, shared the bonds forged in violence and loyalty. Now they looked at him like a stranger. "You want to tell them, Tank, or should I?" Reaper's voice carried the promise of violence barely held in check. Tank stepped forward, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. "I'll tell them myself." His voice came out steadier than he felt. "What I found that night at the dogfighting ring, it wasn't what any of us thought." He reached down and unlatched the carrier. Luna emerged slowly, her compact form moving with fluid grace as she assessed the room full of dangerous men. Several brothers shifted in their seats, hands moving instinctively toward weapons as they caught sight of her unusual features. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered from the back. "What the hell is that thing?" Luna's ears twitched at the sound, but she remained calm, positioning herself between Tank and the hostile crowd. Her presence seemed to fill the warehouse with an otherworldly energy that made the air itself feel different, charged with possibilities none of them could comprehend. "That's what I've been trying to figure out," Tank said, his hand moving protectively toward Luna. "But I know what she isn't. She isn't a threat to anyone who doesn't threaten her first." Reaper slammed his fist on the table, the sound reverberating through the warehouse like a gunshot. "That thing has brought heat down on all of us. The feds are sniffing around, asking questions about exotic animals, about that freak show you turned the pit into. You think they're gonna stop with you?" "The feds were coming anyway," Tank shot back, feeling Luna press against his leg. They've been building a case for months. This just gave them an excuse to move faster. An excuse you handed them on a silver platter, Cobra interjected, rising from his chair. Along with whatever government interest comes with harboring some kind of genetic experiment. The room erupted in angry voices as brothers chose sides, some defending Tank's years of loyal service, others demanding answers about what Luna really was and what her presence meant for their survival. Through it all, Reaper watched with calculating eyes, letting the chaos build to a crescendo before raising his hand for silence. "Enough," he commanded, and the warehouse fell quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. "There's only one way this ends, Tank. You know the rules. The club comes first. Always." Tank felt Luna's warmth against his leg and made his choice. The fluorescent lights of the emergency veterinary clinic cast harsh shadows across Marcus's weathered face as he paced the sterile waiting room. His boots echoed against the polished floor, each step a countdown to news he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The antiseptic smell reminded him of hospitals, where he'd waited for news about fallen brothers, but this felt different, more personal, more desperate. Zoe sat curled in a plastic chair, her small frame dwarfed by Marcus's leather jacket draped around her shoulders. The jacket, adorned with patches that told stories of violence and rebellion, now served as a blanket for a frightened child whose only companion lay fighting for life behind closed doors. "He's going to be okay, right?" Zoe's voice barely rose above a whisper. Marcus stopped pacing and looked down at her. 3 weeks ago, he would have had no idea how to comfort a child. Hell, 3 weeks ago, he would have walked away from this entire situation. But something had shifted in him, something he couldn't name or fully understand. "Little guy's tougher than he looks," Marcus said, settling into the chair beside her. "Trust me on that." The sliding doors opened with a mechanical hiss, and Detective Sarah Chen entered, her badge visible on her belt. Marcus tensed automatically. Old habits died hard, but Chen raised her hand in a peaceful gesture. "Relax, Marcus. I'm here about Zoe, not you." She pulled up a chair across from them. "How is he?" "Still in surgery," Marcus replied, surprised by the concern in the detective's voice. "Doc said the internal bleeding was worse than they thought." Chen nodded, then focused on Zoe. "Sweetheart, I have some news about your mom." Zoe's head snapped up, hope and fear warring in her eyes. "Is she okay? Can I see her?" "She's alive," Chen said carefully. "But she's in the hospital too. The people who hurt your friend also hurt her pretty badly. She's going to be okay, but it's going to take some time." Marcus watched Zoe's face crumple, and without thinking, he reached over and squeezed her shoulder. The gesture felt foreign yet natural, like muscle memory from a life he'd never lived. "What about Donnie Torres?" Marcus asked. Chen's expression hardened. "In custody. Turns out your little friend there led us to a much bigger operation than we expected. Torres was running illegal animal fights, among other things. When we raided his compound, we found evidence of trafficking, drug distribution, and worse." "Good," Marcus said, meaning it. The word surprised him with its vehemence. "There's something else," Chen continued. "We found records at Torres's place. Your friend isn't just any creature, he's been genetically modified. Some kind of underground experiment that went wrong. Torres bought him from a black market lab that was shut down last year." Marcus felt his blood chill. "What kind of modifications?" "Enhanced intelligence, accelerated healing, heightened senses. The paperwork we found suggests he was part of a military research project that got out of hand. The scientists couldn't control what they'd created, so they sold the subjects to the highest bidders." The weight of this revelation settled over Marcus like a lead blanket. No wonder the little creature had seemed so aware, so unnaturally perceptive. He'd been carrying around a living weapon disguised as a pet. "Does that change anything?" Zoe asked quietly. "About whether he's good or bad?" Marcus looked at her, seeing his own question reflected in her young face. Was he good or bad? He'd done terrible things, hurt people, lived by violence for decades. But these past weeks had shown him something different about himself, something he'd thought was long dead. "No," he said firmly, "it doesn't change anything. He's still him." A door opened, and Dr. Amanda Walsh emerged, still wearing surgical scrubs. Her face was tired but not defeated, which Marcus took as a good sign. "Surgery went well," she announced. "The internal bleeding has stopped, and we've repaired the damaged organs. He's incredibly resilient. His healing factor is unlike anything I've seen. He should make a full recovery." Zoe burst into tears of relief, and Marcus found his own eyes unexpectedly wet. He cleared his throat roughly, blaming the harsh lighting. "When can we see him?" Zoe asked. "He's still sedated, but you can visit briefly. Just remember, he needs rest." As they stood to follow Dr. Walsh, Chen touched Marcus's arm. "There's going to be paperwork, hearings, decisions about custody for both Zoe and the creature. You've made quite an impression on people, Marcus. Changed some minds about who you really are." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His old life felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone smaller and more afraid than he'd ever admitted. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone, and neither would they. The three of them walked toward the recovery room, an unlikely family bound together by circumstance and choice. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Tank paced the waiting room, his boots squeaking against the linoleum. Pip lay motionless in the carrier, her breathing shallow and labored. The seizure had lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours watching her tiny body convulse while he held her helplessly. Dr. Martinez emerged from the examination room, her expression grave. "We need to talk." Tank's stomach dropped. He'd seen that look before, on the faces of doctors delivering news no one wanted to hear. "How bad?" "The X-rays show significant damage to her nervous system, old injuries, probably from repeated trauma." She pulled up digital images on her tablet. "See these fractures in her skull? They've healed improperly, creating pressure points that can trigger seizures." Tank stared at the ghostly white images of Pip's skeleton, each break a testament to cruelty he couldn't fathom. "Can you fix it?" "Surgery might help, but it's risky. She's so small, and given her species." Dr. Martinez hesitated. "Tank, I have to ask, have you considered what happens if word gets out about what she really is?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Tank had been avoiding that reality for weeks, but now it crashed down on him. Wildlife services, government agencies, scientists who'd want to study Pip like a lab rat, the media circus that would follow. "She's not going anywhere," he said firmly. Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. "Then we do the surgery. But I'll need help. Someone I trust completely. My partner, Dr. Chen, specializes in neurological procedures. We'd have to bring her in." "Can she keep her mouth shut?" Tank thought about the way Pip looked at him, the intelligence in those ancient eyes, the trust she'd somehow found despite everything humans had done to her. What's the alternative? The seizures will get worse, more frequent. Eventually, do the surgery. 3 hours later, Tank sat in his truck in the clinic parking lot, chain-smoking and watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. His phone buzzed constantly, messages from the club wanting to know where he was. He'd missed church, their weekly mandatory meeting, without explanation. In the MC world, that was tantamount to treason. His phone rang. Razor's name flashed on the screen. "You better be bleeding out somewhere," Razor's voice crackled through the speaker. "Had to handle something." "Handle what?" "You missed church, Tank. Brothers are asking questions." Tank closed his eyes. The club had been his family for 15 years, the only constant in a life built on chaos and violence. But sitting here, waiting to see if a tiny creature would survive surgery, he realized something had shifted. The brotherhood that once felt like everything now seemed distant, hollow. "Tell them I'll make it up to them. That's not how this works, and you know it. Diablo wants to see you. Tonight." The line went dead. Tank dropped the phone on the passenger seat and lit another cigarette. Diablo was the club president, A man whose reputation for violence made Tank look like a choir boy. Missing church without permission was a punishable offense, and punishment in the Devil's Rejects usually involved pain. Dr. Martinez appeared at his window, her surgical mask pulled down around her neck. Tank's heart hammered as he rolled down the window. "She made it through," Dr. Martinez said, and Tank felt his knees go weak with relief. "But she's going to need round-the-clock care for the next few days. Someone needs to monitor her constantly, watch for complications." "I'll do it, Tank, constantly. Every few hours, checking her responses, making sure she's stable. You can't leave her alone." He nodded without hesitation. "Whatever she needs." "There's something else." Dr. Martinez glanced around the empty parking lot. "During surgery, we found something. A small metal fragment embedded near her skull. It looks like part of a microchip." Tank's blood ran cold. "What kind of microchip?" "We won't know until we analyze it, but given what Pip is..." She paused. "This wasn't random abuse, Tank. Someone was experimenting on her. Someone with resources and knowledge." The implications hit him like a freight train. If Pip had been part of some kind of research project, people would be looking for her. People with power, with reach, with reasons to keep their activities secret. People who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who got in their way. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Razor, 1 hour. "Clubhouse, don't make this worse." Tank looked through the clinic window where Pip lay unconscious, a tiny bandage wrapped around her head like a miniature warrior's helmet. In one direction lay his old life, the brotherhood, the violence, the certainty of belonging somewhere. In the other direction lay uncertainty, danger, and a creature that trusted him completely. For the first time in his adult life, the choice was easy. He turned off his phone and walked back into the clinic. The emergency veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Jake cradled the small, trembling form against his leather jacket. Dr. Sarah Chen worked quickly, her hands steady despite the bizarre circumstances that had brought them all here at 3 in the morning. "The wing fracture is healing well," she said, gently examining the creature that had turned Jake's world upside down. "But these new developments are extraordinary. I've never seen anything like this rate of growth and change." What had started as a puppy-sized being now stood nearly 2 feet tall, its scales shimmering with an iridescent quality that seemed to shift between emerald and gold under the harsh lights. The wings, once barely visible nubs, now stretched impressively when unfurled, and intelligence sparkled in those ancient-looking eyes. "How long before—" Jake started. But the clinic door burst open with a crash that sent medical instruments clattering to the floor. "There he is!" Diesel's voice boomed through the small examination room, followed by the heavy footsteps of at least 6 other club members. "Jake, you son of a bitch, you think you can just disappear on us?" The creature instinctively pressed closer to Jake, a low, rumbling sound emanating from its throat that made the windows vibrate. Dr. Chen stepped protectively in front of her patient, a small frame no match for the wall of leather and anger that had invaded her clinic. "You need to leave," she said firmly. "This is a medical facility." Diesel laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "Medical facility? Lady, we're here for our brother who's lost his damn mind over some freak show." "Diesel, just listen," Jake began. But his former friend cut him off. "Listen? I listened when you missed 3 runs. I listened when you started talking about responsibility and change. But this?" He gestured wildly at the creature. "This is where it ends, Jake. The club voted. You're out." The words hit Jake harder than any physical blow. 23 years with the Hells Angels, and it was ending here, in a veterinary clinic, over a being no one could explain or understand. "You can't just..." "I can, and I am. You chose that thing over your brothers, over everything we built together." Diesel's voice cracked slightly, revealing the hurt beneath the anger. "Hand it over, Jake. There are people willing to pay serious money for whatever the hell that is." The creature stepped forward, placing itself between Jake and the advancing bikers. Its wings spread wide, casting shifting shadows on the walls, and that rumbling sound intensified. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that made everyone's hair stand on end. "Nobody's touching him," Jake said quietly, his hand resting on the creature's back. The warmth there grounded him, reminded him of all the nights they'd spent together, all the ways this small being had taught him what protection really meant. "Him?" Diesel spat. "You're calling it him now? Jesus, Jake, listen to yourself. You've gone completely soft." "Maybe I have." Jake stood slowly, feeling something fundamental shift inside him. Maybe that's not the worst thing that could happen. The creature looked up at him, those intelligent eyes seeming to understand every word. In that moment, Jake realized that everything Diesel was saying was true. He had changed. The man who used to settle disputes with his fists, who found purpose in violence and brotherhood built on intimidation, was gone. "This is your last chance," Diesel said, pulling a gun from his jacket. "Step away from that thing, or we'll take it by force." Dr. Chen gasped, reaching for her phone, but Tank, one of the newer prospects, knocked it from her hands. The creature's rumbling intensified, and small sparks began dancing along its scales. "You really want to do this?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the weapon pointed at his chest. 23 years, and you're going to end it like this? You ended it the day you brought that monster home." The creature suddenly reared up on its hind legs, wings beating powerfully. The sparks along its scales grew brighter, and a sound unlike anything Jake had ever heard filled the room, part roar, part song, completely otherworldly. The bikers stumbled backward, and even Diesel's gun hand wavered. In that charged moment, Jake understood what he had to do. The life he'd known was over, but something new was beginning. Something that scared and exhilarated him in equal measure. "Then I guess we're done here," he said, scooping the creature into his arms. "But you're not taking him. Not today, not ever." The creature's wings folded around Jake protectively as he moved toward the clinic's back exit, Dr. Chen quickly stepping aside to let them pass. Behind them, Diesel's curses echoed through the fluorescent-lit room. But Jake didn't look back. Outside, the first hints of dawn were touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold that perfectly matched his companion's scales. The warehouse felt like a tomb when Marcus stepped inside, his boots echoing against concrete that had seen too much blood over the years. Diesel's body lay where it had fallen 3 days ago, covered now by a tarp that couldn't hide the stench of death. The other members of the Devil's Disciples stood in a semicircle around their fallen president, their faces masks of barely contained rage. "You brought this on us," snarled Tommy the Tank Rodriguez, Diesel's lieutenant. His scarred hands gripped a tire iron like he was born holding it. "Your little freak show got our president killed." Marcus kept his hands visible but ready. Behind him, Spark and 3 other angels flanked the entrance, while the rest of his crew waited outside on their bikes. The small dragon, Luna, as the kid Sarah had named her, remained hidden in his jacket, her tiny heartbeat rapid against his chest. "Diesel made his choice," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years riding with killers and saints. "He came after something that wasn't his to take." "That thing ain't natural." Tommy stepped forward, spittle flying from his lips. "It's some kind of demon, and you're harboring it like it's a goddamn pet." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. 3 months ago he would have agreed. 3 months ago he would have crushed anything that threatened the natural order of his world. But Luna had shown him something he'd forgotten existed, innocence that needed protection rather than corruption. "Maybe," Marcus admitted. "But she's under my protection now." The warehouse erupted in angry shouts. 15 disciples against 6 angels, odds that would have excited the old Marcus. Now they just made him tired. Violence had been his language for so long, but Luna had taught him there were other ways to communicate. Tommy's grip on the tire iron tightened. "We can handle some lab coats. Can you handle the FBI task force that's been tracking unusual animal acquisitions, the one that's already shut down 3 dog-fighting rings in the past month?" Marcus pulled out his phone, showing photos Jenna had sent him. They're getting close, Tommy, real close. The room fell silent. These men understood federal heat better than most. It could evaporate entire organizations overnight. You're lying, Tommy said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Ask your boy Carlos. Marcus nodded toward a nervous-looking disciple near the back, the one who's been moving stolen exotics through the port. Ask him if the feds have been sniffing around his contacts. Carlos shifted uncomfortably, and Marcus knew he'd hit the mark. Jenna's intelligence network had proven invaluable. Former military connections and journalistic sources had painted a clear picture of the federal investigation closing in on illegal animal trafficking rings. What do you want? Tommy demanded. Simple. You walk away from this. Stop looking for her. Stop spreading word about what you saw. In return, I give you information about the federal investigation, dates, targets, which of your operations they're watching. It was a gamble, offering intelligence that could save their criminal enterprise, but Marcus had learned that sometimes you had to give your enemies what they wanted to protect what mattered most. Tommy looked around at his crew, reading faces hardened by years of violence, but softened by the prospect of federal prison. The disciples' drug operation, their weapons trafficking, their protection rackets, all of it would crumble under sustained federal attention. And if we refuse? Marcus smiled, the expression carrying no warmth. Then Luna and I disappear. You get nothing, and in 6 months you're all wearing orange jumpsuits, wondering why you chose pride over profit. Luna stirred against his chest, probably sensing his elevated heart rate. Her tiny claws pricked through his shirt, a reminder that despite her magical nature, she was still vulnerable, still dependent on him for protection. The standoff stretched like a taut wire. Marcus could feel Sparks' tension behind him, knew his sergeant-at-arms was calculating angles and escape routes. But this wasn't about fighting their way out. It was about ending a cycle that could destroy everything they'd built. 3 days, Tommy finally said. You've got 3 days to prove this federal thing is real. Then we get the intel. Deal. Marcus turned to leave, then paused. And Tommy? Diesel died because he forgot the first rule of this life. Sometimes walking away takes more balls than fighting. As they walked back to their bikes, Spark fell into step beside him. Think they'll honor it? Marcus climbed onto his Harley, feeling Luna settle into her customized compartment. Doesn't matter. We bought time, and time's all we need. The engines roared to life, and the angels pulled away from the warehouse, leaving behind the stench of death and the promise of an uncertain peace. The warehouse felt different now, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm clouds gathering outside. Tank stood in the center of the main floor, surrounded by his brothers, but for the first time in months he didn't feel like he was facing them alone. Maya perched on his shoulder, her tiny hand gripping his leather vest, while behind him stood an unlikely alliance that would have been unthinkable just hours before. Detective Sarah Chen had arrived with a team of federal agents, but instead of the raid everyone expected, she'd come to offer a deal. The evidence Tank had provided, financial records, shipping manifests, and recorded conversations he'd gathered over weeks of careful observation, painted a damning picture of Rex's operation that went far beyond the club's traditional activities. You've got 2 choices, Chen announced to the assembled bikers. Stand with Rex and go down with his human trafficking ring, or help us take him down and maybe salvage what's left of your brotherhood. Rex's face had gone pale beneath his graying beard. Tank, you backstabbing piece of... Enough. The voice that cut through the tension belonged to Diesel, the club's sergeant-at-arms. He stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the concrete floor. I've been riding with this club for 23 years. We've done plenty of things I ain't proud of, but selling kids? That ain't what we signed up for. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Tank watched as the brotherhood Rex had tried to poison against him began to fracture along different lines entirely. The younger members, the ones who'd been drawn to Rex's promise of easy money, shuffled nervously. But the old-timers, the ones who remembered what the club used to stand for, began moving toward Diesel. Maya chirped softly, and Tank felt her tiny claws dig gently into his shoulder. She'd been unusually calm throughout the confrontation, as if she understood the gravity of what was happening. Over the past weeks, she'd become more than just his companion. She'd become his compass, pointing him toward a version of himself he'd forgotten existed. "The feds found your warehouse in Oakland," Tank said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "The one where you've been keeping the girls before shipping them out. 3 of them were under 16 wrecks." The words hit like a physical blow. Tank watched several of his brothers recoil, their faces twisting with disgust. Whatever loyalty Rex had commanded was evaporating by the second. "You got no proof." "I was there," Tank interrupted. "I saw them. I saw what you were doing to them." His hand moved instinctively to Maya, drawing comfort from her presence. "And I realized I couldn't be part of it anymore. Not for the club, not for brotherhood, not for anything." Rex's hand moved toward his waistband, but Diesel was already in motion. The sergeant-at-arms had always been quick despite his size, and before Rex could clear leather, he found himself face down on the concrete with Diesel's knee in his back. "That's for destroying something that took 50 years to build," Diesel growled. Chen moved forward with zip ties, but Tank barely noticed. Around him, his brothers were making their choices. Some slipped toward the exits, unwilling to face the consequences of their association with Rex's operation. Others stood their ground, ready to cooperate and try to rebuild something from the wreckage. But Tank's attention was focused on the small creature on his shoulder. Maya had changed everything, not through some magical transformation, but by giving him something to protect, something innocent to care about. In caring for her, he'd remembered how to care about himself, about right and wrong, about the man he wanted to be rather than the one he'd become. Tank. Chen approached him as the other agents processed Rex and his remaining loyalists. "The federal prosecutor wants to meet with you tomorrow. With your testimony and the evidence you provided, we can shut down the entire network." He nodded, understanding that tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be trials, depositions, and the constant threat of retaliation from Rex's associates outside the club. But there would also be something else, a chance to start over, to build something better from the ashes of what had been destroyed. Diesel walked over, his weathered face creased with exhaustion. "So what happens now?" Tank looked around the warehouse, at the scattered remnants of his former life. The club would survive in some form, it always did, but it would be different, smaller, hopefully cleaner, and he might not be part of it. Maya chirped again, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. She'd taught him that sometimes the smallest, most unexpected things could change everything. That redemption wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic transformations. It was about daily choices, small acts of kindness, and the courage to choose love over fear. "Now we rebuild," he said simply. "All of us." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Martinez read the final verdict. Tank stood with his shoulders straight, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, feeling the weight of 18 months in federal prison settle around him like an old leather jacket. But as he listened to the judge's words about his cooperation bringing down the Crimson Serpent's trafficking operation, he felt something he'd never experienced before, pride that didn't come from violence. Behind him, Sarah sat in the front row with Luna curled in her lap, the little dragon's scales shimmering pale gold in the afternoon light streaming through the courthouse windows. The creature had grown during the months of testimony and investigation, now the size of a house cat, her intelligent amber eyes watching Tank with unwavering loyalty. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Martinez continued, "your testimony has been instrumental in dismantling one of the largest drug and exotic animal trafficking rings we've seen in this district. The court recognizes your transformation and the genuine nature of your cooperation." Tank nodded, catching Sarah's eye. She mouthed 18 months and held up Luna, who chirped softly. They'd prepared for this moment. Sarah would care for Luna while he served his time, and the sanctuary would continue its work. The federal agents had been surprisingly understanding about Luna's unique nature, classifying her as an undisclosed protected species in the official records. As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Tank turned to address the courtroom one final time. "Your Honor, I spent 30 years believing strength came from fear and violence. I was wrong. Real strength comes from protecting something more vulnerable than yourself." The words carried across the packed courtroom, where former Hells Angels members sat alongside federal agents, sanctuary volunteers and reporters. Bulldog, now clean-shaven and wearing a button-down shirt, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Snake sat beside him, the club's former enforcer, who had followed Tank's lead in cooperating with authorities. Outside the courthouse, the media waited with cameras and microphones. The story of the Hells Angels president who discovered a dragon and brought down a criminal empire had captured national attention. But Tank barely noticed the chaos as Sarah approached with Luna. "She knows," Sarah said quietly, holding the dragon close enough for Tank to stroke her scales one last time. "She understands you're protecting her by doing this." Luna nuzzled against Tank's scarred knuckles, her warm breath carrying that familiar scent of summer rain and wildflowers. She made a sound somewhere between a purr and a trill, and Tank could swear he saw understanding in her ancient eyes. "Take care of our girl," he whispered to Sarah, "and keep the sanctuary growing. Those other creatures we rescued from the serpents are going to need time to heal." The federal facility wasn't like the county lockup Tank had experienced in his younger days. Here, he found himself in a minimum security environment where his reputation for cooperation preceded him. Other inmates, many serving time for white-collar crimes, initially gave the tattooed biker a wide berth. But Tank had changed. Instead of intimidation, he offered quiet help to younger inmates struggling with addiction. Instead of violence, he became known for breaking up fights with words rather than fists. Sarah visited every month, always bringing photos and videos of Luna. The dragon continued growing, now large enough to fly short distances around the sanctuary grounds. She had become something of a local legend, with carefully managed visits from researchers and conservationists who worked with Sarah to understand Luna's unique biology. "She's been helping with the other rescues," Sarah explained during one visit, sliding a tablet across the table to show Tank a video. On screen, Luna sat patiently beside a three-legged wolf, the dragon's presence somehow calming the wild animal enough for medical treatment. "The veterinarians say they've never seen anything like it. She has this way of communicating with traumatized animals." Tank watched his unlikely companion on the small screen, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "She's doing what she was meant to do, what we were both meant to do." As his release date approached, Tank found himself working in the prison's vocational program, learning skills he never thought he'd need: bookkeeping, computer basics, grant writing. Sarah had offered him a position managing the sanctuary's operations, and he was determined to be worthy of her trust. The day finally came when Tank walked through the prison gates as a free man. Sarah waited beside her truck, Luna perched on her shoulder like some mythical familiar. The dragon had grown magnificent during their separation, her scales now deep gold with hints of copper, her wingspan nearly 4 feet when fully extended. Luna launched herself from Sarah's shoulder, gliding directly to Tank's outstretched arms. As she settled against his chest, Tank felt the last pieces of his old life fall away completely. He was no longer Tank Morrison, Hells Angels president. He wasn't even the broken man who had bought a mysterious creature for $1 on a dark street corner. He was simply a man who had learned that redemption comes in the most unexpected forms, and that sometimes saving something small and vulnerable saves you right back.